Hello, hello, everyone. Good to be back together. Don't worry about the recording inside the Zoom. That does it automatically. The stream takes care of the recording. Thank you, though, Marilyn. So welcome back to Story of Us. We are going to keep moving forward in history, but last week when we were in Persia for our little Purim extravaganza, Book of Esther, we are going to stay in Persia. In fact, we are going to stay in Persia, in Babylon, for much of the next few weeks, because the real story that we're going to dig into is this idea of, once again, the capital of Jewish life, the center of Jewish life, shifting away from Israel, certainly away from Jerusalem, and towards Babylon once again. Okay, so first, any lingering questions or thoughts, either on last week's session or on the weeks beforehand, or Story of Us in general, or anything like that before we jump into new content today? Okay. So just backing up for a moment to situate ourselves again. We are after the year 0. We've seen 3 different rebellions against Rome, 3 different wars against Rome that have been disastrous for the Jewish people. First, the rebellion around 68. Again, all these are our side of 0, that leads to the destruction of the temple. Mm-hmm. And I know I've said this over and over again, but remember, the temple being destroyed, you should think White House down. That it's a symbol for an entire civilization, an entire governmental system, an entire, really a city in many ways, just being destroyed. Everyone's familiar with the Kotel, the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall. Do we know what the Kotel actually is? Does anyone know?
Wasn't it a wall of the temple?
So it was not actually a wall of the temple. If you think about the way that the temple was built, the temple is built on top of a mountain. Mountain is a strong word for what we find in Israel, a large hill. We call it a mountain. And it's built on the stone, right? The stone that is up there that has all of these sort of stories associated with it, from the Akedah and the binding of Isaac to there's stories in the Quran that become associated with it. And but the temple is built upon that firmament. In fact, the firmament that the Midrash says was the first firm ground in creation that emerged from the oceans. But the temple is there on top of a mountain, and if you're going to build a building on top of a mountain, you have to have a retaining wall that you fill with dirt to create a flat area that you can put your building on top of. Make sense? Yeah? Mm-hmm. The Romans tore down every stone by stone of the temple, as a way of really punishing the Jews, and sort of shaming and degrading us as well, other than one wall of the retaining wall. And that one wall of the retaining wall was left up as a reminder of what had been there as everything else was destroyed. In that one wall of the retaining wall that is still there is the Kotel, is the Western Wall. So that was all that the Romans left. And this was really a destruction of Jerusalem and of the Jewish life and Judean life that was around it. Now, we spent a lot of time, we're not going to go over it again, but we spent a lot of time looking at the various sects of Jews. Notice I'm not saying sects of Judaism here. The sects of Jews that existed during the Roman era. And the reason I'm saying of Jews rather than of Judaism is because the religious distinctions between these groups, I really believe, were secondary to the political distinctions. And in fact, in many ways, the political distinctions drive the religious distinctions, not the other way around. So one of the themes we've seen with the Pharisees, with the early rabbis, is that they were opposed to uprisings against the Romans. It seems pretty clear that this is a pragmatic decision. This is not theological, but instead there's this view amongst the rabbis that continuing to rebel against the Romans will lead to the totality of our destruction, in that it is just impossible to imagine what success against Rome would possibly look like from a military perspective. I think just taking a reasonable look at it, they were right. But what this means is that after the temple is destroyed, the Pharisees are viewed as a little more tolerable by the Romans than any other group. We looked at the text of Rabbi Yochanan being snuck out of Jerusalem while it was under siege, and going and begging the Roman general to create a sort of a yeshiva, a Jewish enclave for rabbinical learning in Yavne. Even as the story itself clearly is mythological, it tells the story of how Yavne became the center of Judaism and of Jewish life religiously, and that's because the Romans allowed it. So let's talk about the Sanhedrin for a second. The Sanhedrin, there's all sorts of debate about how important it ever really was. One of the thoughts is that the Sanhedrin, prior to the destructions, had some importance, but was not primarily a rabbinic court, but was made up of the powerful nobility, connected folks, the Sadducees who were connected, the priests, the moneyed interests, folks like that could be on the Sanhedrin. But after the destruction, after the rebellion, after 68, the Sanhedrin becomes populated only with Pharisees. Why? Because the Romans say that only Pharisees can be a part of the Sanhedrin. Because Pharisees are the ones who weren't trying to rebel against them. And so I think it's really fair to accuse, in some ways, the Pharisees and the early rabbis of being Roman collaborators in post-temple world. But even if we don't go quite that far, contemporary scholarship of the last 20, 30 years has really honed in on the ways in which it is the Romans elevating the Pharisees which creates the legitimacy and the power that the rabbis end up having, not the other way around. So it's not that the rabbis were gaining acceptance amongst the people, but that because the rabbis had gained acceptance by the Romans, then the Romans put them in places of power, and then the regular people had to acknowledge the Pharisees because they actually had power by dealing with Rome. Thoughts on that?
I thought the Sadducees were also opposed to rebellion.
So the Sadducees probably are also opposed to rebellion, but the Sadducees are really just another word for the existing power structure of Jewish leadership in the noble class and in the priestly class. That's really who the Sadducees were, more than being a movement. The Pharisees, the Zealots, the Essenes, the Qumran community, the Sicarii with their swords, these are the groups that are the fringy folk. And what distinguished the Pharisees is that they were not interested in taking up arms. And that's, again, what we saw in that story of Rabbi Yochanan, as opposed to his nephew, who was one of the Zealots. Okay, thoughts, questions on the way that we've set this up? So all of a sudden, the idea of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, who gathers the Tanaim, who gathers the rabbis and the teachers and the people who had memorized the teachings of the oral Torah in order to write down the Mishnah, all of a sudden Yehuda Hanassi and his group of Jews around the Galilee has a very different feel to it. These are people who aren't doing something while Rome's not looking. They're accommodationists with Rome who are allowed to continue existing and teaching as a part of the accommodation with Rome, as a part of preaching not nonviolence, but pragmatic anti-rebellion, which is just such a different concept of the rabbis, of the early rabbis, than I had ever had. Okay, thoughts on all of this setup. So we've got Yehuda Hanassi and his band of accommodationist with Rome folks creating a non-nationalistic Jewish movement around the Galilee. We have a destroyed Jerusalem, meaning the Jews are primarily not in Judea. Right? Jews have been driven out of Judea, which is really just the little region around Jerusalem. The Galilee is not a part of classic Judea. And then, of course, where's the other large group of Jews? In Persia, in Babylon, the Jews who never left.
How do you distinguish between Babylon and Persia?
So Jewish sources, did you all hear the question? How do we distinguish between Babylon and Persia? Jewish sources during this time tend to refer to all of it as Babylon. And so for our purposes, the distinction ends up being who's in charge of that region politically more than anything else. Today we're going to deal with what is known as the Neo-Persian Empire, but don't worry about that. We'll get there in a second. Larry. That comes later. In our history, and that is really a product of. So going backwards for a moment, one of the things, hopefully, that we reinforced over and over again is this idea that we should think of the early the early Jesus movement as being a Jewish movement that is a close cousin of the Pharisaical movement, which is a close cousin of all of these other fringy groups, right? All the other messianic movements and so on and so forth. So we very much tried to map out the Gospel of Matthew and its anti-Jewish, anti-Pharisaical polemics as being about the politics of that moment. That their biggest competitor for trying, it's like you've got Colrena and CRC fighting over you, Larry. We both want you to join our congregation, and so CRC's bashing Colrena, and Colrena's bashing CRC, and then hundreds of years later, someone is finding these documents and turning them into anti-Jewish documents, when actually they were very much intra-Jewish politics in the moment that they were written. So that's how the Pharisaical idea as a polemic against Jews begins to really be a part of Christian culture. Early Middle Ages probably, but we'll get there. Okay, I thought I saw another hand. No?
Had there not been these accommodations, and had there not been a group that was complicit with the Romans, would everybody have just been wiped out?
Yeah. Well, the people wouldn't have been wiped out, but the culture and the identity probably. And there's this, we looked at that scene of Rabbi Yochanan being snuck out of Jerusalem and making this deal, this accommodationist deal. The scene we didn't look at, which is just gorgeous and heartbreaking, is the story of Rabbi Yochanan's death. And when he dies on his deathbed, it's clear that he's having second thoughts, right? He saved Judaism, his brand of Judaism. In fact, he ended up with his brand of Judaism all of a sudden in power, at the cost of Judea, and at the cost of many, many Judeans. And in his death scene, you see this sense of, could he have asked for more? Could he have done more? Could he have saved more people and maybe saved his own movement a little less? Yeah, great thought, Nancy. Any other questions before we keep going? Okay, so let's move to the Jews of Babylon. So while this is all happening, Babylonian Jews see all sorts of various movements. In fact, there's a few different Jewish kingdoms that emerge within Babylon. They're called robber kingdoms, which I think means that they're sort of like pirates on land during this time period, but end up controlling certain areas of Babylon, of Persia, during this early period, the first few centuries of the millennia. We see Jews begin to concentrate more and more in the urban centers. Christians start to make their way into Persia, but they're spread out. Jews are concentrated in the urban areas. We also see an influx of Jews to Babylon after the Roman destruction of Jerusalem, for obvious reasons. In fact, if you look at the Talmud, if you look at the Mishnah and the Talmud, there are all of these ideas that say you are never allowed to migrate from Israel to Babylon. You're not allowed to leave Israel. This is where a lot of the ideas of better to live in Israel come from. And they're probably very much about the politics of this moment as Israel is losing its population of Jews who are being driven out, many of whom are making their way to the Babylonian communities. But these Babylonian communities have been figuring out how to do Jewish away from Jerusalem for a long time. We have moments where they try to build temples, where they establish priesthoods that are offering sacrifices in these regions. But remember, even the whole idea of having the Torah comes out of Babylon, comes out of Persia. And that's a way to make Jewish identity portable, or to make Judean identity portable, which is what we call Jewish identity. Right? Jewish identity is just a portable Judean identity. It merges into this. So that is what's happening to Jews in Persia during this time period. We're in the first couple centuries of the Common Era. But what's happening in Persia is that after the collapse of its importance, after the loss of a number of wars, there is a reemergence of Persian nationalism. And it's Persian religious nationalism. So there is the creation of a theocratic Persian empire. Anyone know the faith of this Persian empire? This is a Zoroastrian theocratic. It's religious nationalism, like we know religious nationalism today, like the Maccabees instituted a religious nationalist state, like the Jews who came back from Persia instituted a religious nationalist state. This is a Zoroastrian Persian nationalist empire. This is around the year 220 or so that this is established. And you would think that this would be an empire that would not be friendly to Jews, right? Who have a distinct faith tradition, religious tradition, cultural tradition that is separate from Persian Zoroastrian culture. And it's what we would expect, except the early great emperor, Shapur I, becomes very good friends with one of the most important non-rabbis of the Talmud, Shmuel, who is never ordained as a rabbi, but for all intents and purposes is a rabbi of the Talmud, is quoted constantly in the Talmud, and is one of the people who live in this Talmudic border moment. Okay, let's talk about Talmudic time for a second. I know, sorry, we're going from here to here to here, but I promise we will circle it all together. So Jewish time, intra-mythological Jewish time, not extra-historical time, but intra-Jewish mythological time, divides up the first couple hundred years, call it until the year 200 or so, of the Common Era as the Tannaitic period. A Tana, remember, is either a name for one of the people who's memorized parts of the Oral Torah, or is a title given to the rabbis of the Mishnah. Once the Mishnah is completed by Yehuda Hanassi in the year 200, the process of writing the Gemara begins, And the rabbis who show up in the Gemara are known as the Amoraim. So you may wonder what the connection there is, and it's that ayin of Amoraim is often turned into a G when moving between languages. Maybe the most famous example of that is the Gaza Strip in Hebrew is Aza with that ayin. And it's that guttural sound. And if you listen to Mizrahi Jews who lived in Arab countries, Muslim countries, they will often pronounce an ayin as a guttural stop back here, whereas an aleph is up front. Today, when most people learn Hebrew, you are taught that the aleph and the ayin are both silent letters. That was not the story in the past and is still a distinction made amongst some Hebrew speakers today. So the Amoraim are the people of the Gemara. Did that make sense? Mm-hmm. Hopefully that helps to remember it.
And that was from 200 to...
200 onwards for the next 300-400 years. So these are these two groups of people, and they become incredibly different groups. For instance, if you are in Amora, you are not allowed to question someone who lived during the Tanaitic period. You can argue all you want with the other Amoras, even if you live 150 years after them. You can argue all you want within the Gemara, but you can't question a Tana, one of the rabbis of the Mishnah. So what this really reinforces is how wildly this is seen as a thick line within Jewish history. And that's because the Tanaim, the rabbis of the Mishnah, are the rabbis who live in a Jewish civilization in the land of Israel. The Amoraim, the rabbis of the Gemara, are rabbis who are living after the Jewish civilization in Israel has been decimated. They are living at a moment where the Babylonian Jewish community becomes ascendant and becomes the center. So we're going to talk about two different personalities today from this in-between period of the Amoraim and the Tanaim. We're going to talk about Rav and Shmuel. Okay. Before we talk about them, though, any questions? Did everything we just said make sense? Do you feel like you have a sense of these places and these lands and what's happening history-wise? The other context I didn't lay out is, of course, that Persia is constantly now going to war with Rome. These are two great powers that are facing off against each other. So when the Persians allowed Jews to have a measure of freedom that we wouldn't expect in a Zoroastrian nationalist state, part of it is clearly this personal friendship of Shapur and Shmuel, but part of it also is the Jews keep rebelling against Rome. The Jews are a real thorn in the side of Rome, and particularly as Rome becomes more and more a Christian empire, Jews become more and more the consummate enemy, bad guy, scapegoat of the Roman Empire. This is really when we start getting something that looks like anti-Semitism that we would recognize today, as opposed to just anti-Jewishness that is different. And so you can understand why for the Persians, being extra tolerant of the Jews was a way of both winning favor with their enemy's enemy and of just looking different. Let me give a historical comparison to this moment today. One of the reasons why anti-Semitism in the United States after World War II becomes all of a sudden something that is unacceptable increasingly in social circles post-World War II, in a way that it was part and parcel of elite social circles pre-World War II, has to do with the idea that our great enemy, the Nazis, hated the Jews. Therefore, we can show how much better we Americans are than our great enemy by doing the opposite with Jews, right? So that same sort of inverse relationship is happening with the Persians and their relationship to Jews, particularly as Rome becomes less and less hospitable towards Jews. We also see, as Rome becomes less hospitable, including as it becomes Christian, more and more Jews flocking to Persia. There's also, in one of these great wars, probably 150 years after we're talking right now, between Persia and Rome, there's something like 30,000 Judeans living in Roman, at that point it's been renamed Palestine, who join in and fight from behind the lines for the Persians as they're waging a war with Rome. Helene. That's a success story if we didn't confuse you till now, actually. Oh, yeah. So you get a rebellion throughout the empire around the year 100. You get the Bar Kokhba rebellion in the 130s. And these are just the major rebellions. I mean, don't forget that the reason that Rome destroyed the temple in 68 is as a punishment for the Judeans who, from their perspective, wouldn't stop rebelling. This was, the 17th rebellion that Rome had dealt with the Judeans, and they were just done with us. Yeah. No, it does not end. Yeah. Jews inside of their own empire. Exactly. And now you see, perfect, right? Now you see why the Persians are incentivized to be more welcoming and tolerant of Jews within their empire. The Romans never totally destroyed the Persians, and actually the empire that we're talking about right now, which is known as either the Neo-Persian Empire or the Sasanian Empire. If you've learned this history before, it used to be called the Sassanid Empire in English, but it's since become the Sasanian Empire. Has anyone heard of this group before?
How do you spell that?
Sasanian. Sasanian. Oop, and I was hearing something come through. Maybe it was just the echo. Okay, I'm going to hit the mute all button one more time, but if you were saying something, feel free to jump in. Okay, so we're set up. We understand the Jews up in the Sasanian Empire, the Persian Empire. We see that this is becoming the center of Jewish life as opposed to the destroyed Israeli Jewish life, particularly Judean Jewish life, and that really the outpost of Judaism in Israel is around the Galilee. Steve, yeah. Yeah, we're going to talk. That's where we're going exactly right now. You should, first of all, never ask me to spell anything. But these I can spell. One is just called Rav, R-A-V. Just R-A-V. He's also known as Abba Aricha, if you've heard that. I just put it in the chat too. Aricha means tall. Some say it's because of his how important he becomes. There's also a tradition that just says he was really tall. And the other one is named Shmuel. Rav is a little older than Shmuel, but anyhow. Okay, so both of these folks are Babylonian Jews, but wealthy, connected Babylonian Jews who are coming from big, important families. So, hold hold on, I have a note in here. Let me find my note on this, sorry. There we go. Abaricha Rav's family is said to be able to trace back all the way to King David's brother. And as we said, Shmuel was so connected that he becomes a good friend of the emperor of the Persian Empire, the Neo-Persian Empire. So both of these are connected folk who come from wealthy families who end up going, both of them probably with their dads, but maybe on their own, to Israel, where they study in this Galilean academy where Yehuda Hanasi is writing the Mishnah. Rav, a little older, is studying in particular with Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, and so Rav is there while the Mishnah is being written, and Shmuel is just a little bit afterwards, is probably studying with the students of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, though there's a tradition that says that Shmuel, who is also a physician, cures Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi in some sort of eye issue that he was dealing with. That shows up in the Talmud too. Okay, so both of these folks are coming from Babylon, and are coming from a Babylonian world where there are centers of Jewish learning that are connected with the exilarchs. Have we talked about exilarchs yet?
Mm-mm.
Okay. There's the mythological story, and then there's the historical one, as always. The mythological story says, from the moment the Jews are led off into Babylonian enslavement in 586 BCE, the king is taken off, and from that moment on, there's a descendant of the king, meaning straight from King David, that lives in Babylon, that is known as the exilarch, or the king in exile, and is the representative of the Jews to the empire. Once again, just like the Romans end up elevating the Pharisees, because they're willing to work with the Pharisees, the Persians or the Babylonians or whomever is in charge at the various moments, they elevate the exilarch because they treat the exilarch as the official representative of the Jews. And so the custom says that this goes all the way back to 586 BCE. We don't really find any historical reference to this word until the 2nd century of the Common Era, which again is right at this moment that we're dealing with today. So the exilarch is the one who represents Jews to the Persian Empire. And the exilarch is often located in one of these towns that is one of the places that Jews end up concentrating. So the town we're going to start with and really focus on today, you probably know it as Fallujah, which many of us know from the Second Iraq War, but is known Jewishly as Nehardea, which is one of the academies there. It's one of the academies where the Talmud is written. It pre-exists Shmuel and Rav. In fact, Shmuel is sometimes known as Shmuel of Nehardea. But Shmuel goes off and studies the Mishnah, sees this whole project that is happening in the north of Israel, this effort to make Jewish identity portable in the form of the Mishnah, studies there, and then he and Rav, these connected folk, go back to Babylon, go to these communities. Shmuel ends up being the head of Nehardea. Rav starts a new academy just far enough away that they can't be too competitive with each other, but close enough that they can communicate, known as Surah. And these are the academies where the Talmud ends up being written. Often these are the academies where the exilarchs end up holding court. But it's ripe for the Mishnah, because these are places that already have been focused on doing Jewish outside of the temple. And the Mishnah provides that framework. So all of a sudden you have people and texts. The texts of the Mishnah and of the Torah, the people who are Pharisees, who have been accepted as legitimate representatives by the Roman Empire and by the Persian Empire. And this is why Pharisaical Judaism, this is why Rabbinic Judaism really becomes centered in this moment. Okay. Pausing again, thoughts, questions, comments? Nothing? We're just so straightforward, it all makes so much sense here?
Yeah.
Yeah, please. Yeah, great question. Like everything else in the Roman Empire, it goes back to these rebellions. So we have three main rebellions against Rome. We have that first one, which we talked about. Then we have a second huge rebellion that happens around the year 100. We've only referenced this in passing because we don't know much about it historically other than it happened. And this was a rebellion of Jews outside of the empire, or excuse me, outside of Judea within the Roman Empire. And this was so disastrous for those Jewish communities that most of the other Jewish communities within Rome have just been decimated. Murder and just a cleansing of Jews from many of these communities. And again, this swells the ranks of Jews living in Persia, but swells them with Jews who have already learned how to do Jewish identity outside of the temple. And that's the real sort of magical mix that happens here, is all of these Jews who culturally for generations had been involved with extra temple Judaism coming together as the acceptable leadership of the Jewish people to both of these empires. And it allows the centering of what becomes Rabbinic Judaism. Did that make sense? Okay, other questions, other thoughts here? So let me pull up a map that I found that I thought was at least helpful for me. Oop, thank you to whoever just spotlighted me. Okay, so what we see here with some dates, and don't worry too much about the dates for us, is the Roman Empire and the Sasanian Empire. So Rome continues to be the empire of the Mediterranean. But you'll notice that the Sasanian Empire, the Neo-Persian Empire that is fighting all of these wars with Rome over and over again, ends up controlling enough of, I guess what we would now call Turkey, to have a foothold in the Mediterranean, which shows you the ways that Rome is in decline. And eventually, of course, we're talking about the Byzantine Empire that it's coming into contact with. But Rome, by and large, still maintains its empire of the Mediterranean, while the Sasanian Empire is based in the East. And this becomes Jewish code, by the way, the East and the West, talking about Jews in Persia and Babylon and Jews living in the land of Israel.
In
still.
earlier times, we were talking about Northern Kingdom and Southern.
Right.
Northern Kingdom, and now we're in
Just
East and
shifted.
West. Exactly. Exactly. Though it is interesting when you look at these maps after we've looked at all of the maps and seen all the ways that the North and the South and the, right, in some ways these kingdoms and these alliances and these empires are still the same. Right? We were dealing with North African versus Assyrian, Babylonian. That's essentially what we're dealing with in this map. This is, you could take this map and it doesn't look that different than the Assyrians and the Egyptians. It doesn't look that different than the Ptolemaic Hellenistic Empire and the Seleucid Empire. Right? It doesn't look that different from geopolitics of today in some ways. Also, when we look at these maps. So what we're seeing is as things have gotten terrible for Jews within the Roman Empire, it is the Sasanian Empire that becomes the center of Jewish life. And that remains the case. That we are in the transition week right now, but after this week, we're not going to be talking about the land of Israel and the Jews of the land of Israel that much because they've been so diminished. Instead, Babylon will be the center, or Persia, or whatever word we're calling it, will be the center of Jewish life until another center emerges. But that other center is going to be the Iberian Peninsula. That's the next one that's going to emerge. And the Sasanian Empire, John, I see your hand. That Sasanian Empire that we are living in is the empire that exists in this region until it is replaced by Islam. And we're going to look at Islam, but we're going to look at Islam as a religious movement, but even more so, we're going to look at the way that Islam is an Arab movement that takes over the Persian Empire and much of the Roman Empire, and replaces Zoroastrian nationalist Persian with Muslim Arab nationalist, right? It's the same phenomenon we saw with Babylon and Persia, where it's just different competing nationalisms often over the same regions. John. Yes, Sasanian is named after the founding family of this dynasty. The dynasty goes from 224 till 651. I mean, really goes right up until it's replaced by Muhammad. It is also known as the Sassanid Empire or the Neo-Persian Empire. That's the one that's easier to remember and say. It's just the Neo-Persian, meaning the new arrival of a Persian empire as a global geopolitical power in tension with Rome. When you hear about the Roman wars with Persia, not the Roman Republic, but the Roman Empire's wars with Persia, you were talking about generally the Neo-Persian Empire. And certainly once you get into the Byzantine era, you're talking about that. And the whole thing changes how we understand the Crusades also, I think. But we'll get there in 1,000 years or so. Other questions, other thoughts? Please. So Jews end up in Alexandria, going backwards. Now we're in the negative 300s BCE, with the spread of Hellenism. When Judea becomes a part of Alexander the Great's empire, Jews end up congregating inside many of the new Greek cities of the Middle East and North Africa. That's where Jews end up, in those cities. But like everywhere else the Jews end up outside of Judea, it is those Jews who create Judaism. Right? Judeans don't need to create Judaism. Only non-Judeans. This is comparable to what's happening today, right? Didn't the Christians get most of their documents from the Alexandria? I don't know exactly what you're referring to. I do know that one of the theories of what happens to many of the Jews of Greek Africa is that they become Christians. That is one of the great theories of what happens. Yeah. And there was... Go ahead. Yeah, which is a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. That's a Jewish translation that just shows how important. Well, if American Jews need to read a Tanakh in English, and Alexandrian Jews need to read a Tanakh in Greek, it tells you about Hebrew knowledge and acculturation into the local societies. Let me give another example to help explain why it is that non-Jews living outside of Judea are the ones who create Judaism. So even though there is a small and actually increasing reform and conservative movement in Israel today, by and large, Reform Judaism has never been successful in Israel. Why? Because Reform Judaism is about being and doing Jewish in a diaspora context. In Israel, there's no diaspora. Mm-hmm. The way that you become Jewish and raise your kids as Jewish in the United States, regardless of how religious you are, is you join a shul, you send them to camp, you go to the J, in Israel, if you're not religious, the way that you raise your kids as Jews is
They live there.
They live there. Mm-hmm. You send them to school, right? And so these are phenomenons that emerge and serve the needs of the diaspora that are different from the needs of folks who are living in the land itself. It just changes it. Actually, very famously, Marilyn, go ahead. I don't need to tell this next story.
And she's muted.
And it's places where it's already happened. You've got large Jewish populations that, first of all, are living and dealing with the core set of Jewish mythologies and texts, right? From Genesis stories to Exodus stories to just the core stories of Jewish life. You've got people who are figuring out how to do that outside of Jerusalem and outside of Judea. And you've got folks who have been actively trying to integrate Greek philosophy into that. Of course, it makes sense that these would be places that would be ripe for a non-Jewish Jewish movement, right? All of a sudden, there's a group that says, "Hey, you can be a part of this team without being a part of this team, without, in particular, adult circumcision," and it's a fertile ground there. Yeah, thank you. Okay. I don't think we have enough time to go to the next big chunk I have here. Any other questions? I have one more small piece I can do if not. Yeah, John. Galil is the Galilee Sea, the Sea of Galilee, but it also refers to the region around there. I think it's just something idiosyncratic about how it's spoken of. The area is also called, it has a different name in Christian circles. What else is it called? Galil is also known as, whatever, it's okay.
Used to be the
Ukraine, yeah. I've never heard such complaints from Galileans. No. It's, Toby. Yes, it's that the powers that be treat them as the officials, and so everyone else amongst the Jews accepts that because it's reality. The comparison I've made before is to the Council of Presidents of major Jewish organizations in America, which is exactly what it sounds like. We talked about this actually at the Israel program on Wednesday, I believe. But the Council of Presidents is made up of the head of the URJ and the head of the CCAR and the head of the conservative movement and the head of this group and AIPAC and all these different Jewish groups or semi-Jewish groups like AIPAC. We'll just not say anything else about AIPAC, actually. But regardless, all the presidents end up on this council, and then this council has a president itself, and this council was started by Eisenhower. So it's a council with real power, with real influence. It has influence in American Jewry, J Street, the centrist Jewish organization that has been centrist Jewish American organization about Israel that has been tarred as being a far left organization, but is a centrist organization. 10 years ago or so, J Street was kept off of the Council of Presidents. It was a big fuss in the Jewish press. But that just shows that there's power there. The fact that they wanted to be a part of the council and that there were interests trying to keep them off shows that even today that council has power. And being the head of that council has real power and has a relationship with the President of the United States. That council is powerful not because Jews created it, but because the powers that be that we live amongst created it. That's where the power comes from. Similarly, rabbis end up powerful, end up as sort of the rabbinic movement ends up as normative because the Roman Empire accepts them, and separately because the Persian Empire accepts them. The chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, that's a great example, Larry, right? Yeah. Jason. We did an Israel session last Wednesday. I have a fantasy next year, starting in the fall. This is not official yet, but I have a fantasy of every Wednesday at 5 o'clock having a Beit Midrash in person at CRC. So we may do some of that content. What I will say, Jason, is we are going to get to the modern era in the story of us. And when we get to the modern era, we're going to treat it the same way we've treated the historical era. And in fact, that's really one of my favorite parts about the story of us is all of a sudden we will get close enough. It usually happens when we talk about Jewish immigration to the United States, that all of a sudden we get close enough that people have this explosion because you realize that we are impacted sociologically and politically in the exact same way that all of these other people have been. And all of a sudden we see in a real way that our version of Jewish mythology is brand new, just like all of their versions of Jewish mythology were brand new. And so we're making our way there. Here's the biggest. I have no idea. Here's the one prediction I would say, is that if the temple were not destroyed by the Romans, the world would not be Christian and Muslim. Mm-hmm. That there's something about the win of when this happens culturally that takes our tribal stories and appropriates them, all of these non-Jewish communities appropriate them and turn them into universal religions and spread our mythology throughout the world. And I don't think that would have happened otherwise. I think if the temple was not destroyed, the Jesus movement would have been like most of the other movements messianic movements from this era. Or if the temple had been destroyed a little bit earlier or a little bit later, I think similarly. I mean, maybe all of a sudden, instead, people would have Rabbi Akiva as their spiritual savior, or I don't know. But that's the one prediction that I'm willing to go out on, is that Islam and Christianity would not exist, certainly not as we understand them, as global powers, if not for the destruction of the temple at the moment that it was, and the centrality of Jews and our mythology to the wars between these great empires. Right? Let me say it all differently again. It's kind of wild. We're a tiny little minority of these two empires that are going to war with each other, the Persians and the Romans. And effectively what happens is that the Roman Empire becomes Christendom, and the Persian Empire becomes the Islamic Empire. Both of these major empires take our tribal stories and turn them into their own. Is wild. Islam takes a midrashic version of our stories, but we'll get there in a couple weeks.
Wow.
Any other thoughts? Any other questions from anyone? Paul, you look like you're unmuting. No, just okay. We'll see you next week.
That's a lot of information.
Good to be with
Absolutely.
everyone.